Um, um, oh, hey, welcome back. So, continuing on with the long 1960s. We remember the 1960s as a time of hippies, the counterculture, drugs, war protests, radical activism. We don't often remember. Historians have gotten a lot better at this, but we haven't gotten it quite out into the public as much as we need to, is the way in which the conservative movement that we associate with people like Ronald Reagan, the Bushes, Donald Trump today, that these things were forming in the 1950s and especially during the 1960s. The 1960s was a crucial decade for the formation of the conservative movement. And what I want to suggest is that in the 1960s, you didn't have liberals and conservatives fighting each other in the way that you do today. Instead, liberals were fighting liberals predominantly. Radical liberals, whether it was a Martin Luther King Jr., a Tom Hayden, a Kwame Ture, were fighting against Cold War liberals like John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and it was that infighting that really damaged liberalism, especially in the years after 1968. And conservatives, out of that time, they're mobilizing during these years, as I'm going to talk about. But conservatives put themselves in a position where they could really step into the blast zone of the crack-up of liberalism after 1968. And eventually put them in a place to put Ronald Reagan in. Ronald Reagan with his message, as he said in his first inaugural address, government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. A revolutionary sentiment for a country that had been taught since the 1930s and still during the 1960s that government was the solution to our problems. This revolutionary movement, introduced with Ronald Reagan as spokesperson in the late 70s and 1980s, had been forming for some time and was in a strategic position to take advantage of the crack-up of liberalism. Again, as radical liberals and Cold War liberals fought against each other during the 1960s. So let's talk a little bit about this conservative movement. You see on the my left-hand side there, William F. Buckley Jr. Buckley was one of the many leaders of the intellectual conservative movement of the 1950s, what was sometimes called the New Conservatism. Buckley in some ways kind of took all the different strands of the new conservatism together in his person. Buckley was a devout Catholic, and so he spoke for the kind of traditional conservatives of the 1950s who believed that America needed to return to its conservative Christian roots, needed to express, needed to value, hold to family values, and ultimately saw the New Deal states, the Cold War state, is ultimately hurting traditional family values, hurting traditional institutions like the church, the neighborhood. This kind of traditional conservatism looked to empower more kind of local neighborhood church Christian values over against what they saw as the secularizing tendencies of a large state and big government. Which they thought that dependence upon government really took people away from ties, connections to traditional moral groups like family and like church. And so they saw in the 1950s the government, particularly the federal government, is competing in many ways for Americans' moral allegiances and in many ways winning. And so traditional conservatives like Buckley wanted to get back to traditional Christian and family values. Buckley was also a avid reader and promoter of libertarian ideas. libertarianism, especially associated during the 1940s with the Austrian, not Australian, the Australian economist Friedrich Hayek, very much turned on totalitarian governments, and including the New Deal government, which they saw as kind of a slippery slope towards totalitarianism, or what they called collectivism. People like Hayek said we needed to get back to a time in which the economy was separate from the government, and the government took a more limited role towards the economy. This is something that Buckley ultimately embraced too, promoted Hayek's ideas, promoted libertarianism. Buckley's first book, God and Man at Yale, which he wrote in 1952, Buckley had gone to Yale. Please, when you leave SAU, don't write a book like God and Man at SAU, or if you do, don't try to get me fired, which is exactly what Buckley tried to do. He tried to get a bunch of Yale professors fired for teaching godlessness or secularization, but also for teaching big government and not holding to libertarian principles. It both from kind of the concern for traditional Judeo-Christian family values, but also the concern for limited government and free markets. Buckley was against the New Deal state and the Cold War state of these years. Nevertheless, Buckley understood, what good is American freedom, what good is American Christian values if the Soviets can easily invade and beat us. And so Buckley also called for a large military establishment that would be able to fight against the communists, not just contain them, but ultimately attempt to roll back, to liberate. That was the one of the popular terms for conservatives in the 1950s. It wasn't enough for Americans simply to contain the Soviets. They needed to actively liberate communist-controlled areas. Buckley was somebody who spoke for that particular movement too. And he understood the need for a large military establishment. He also understood, the contradictions there. On one hand, he believes America needs to return to limited government principles. On the other hand, he understands the military is a part of America's government, and he's calling for a large military establishment. He recognized that. He would write in an article in 1952, we have to accept these are his terms, we have to accept totalitarian bureaucracy on our own shores for the duration of the fight with the Soviet Union. He recognized that as a contradiction, as a problem for his libertarianism, but he recognized too, again, what good is American freedom if the Soviets can easily defeat us? And so we have to actually actively defend American freedoms, and that might mean having to go against American values of limited government through maintaining a large military establishment. Buckley would, as the term would go, fuse all these different groups, the libertarians, the traditionalists, the liberationists of the kind of foreign policy military establishment. He would fuse all these together and be a spokesperson for all of these. In many ways, one of the most important things that Buckley did was start the magazine The National Review in the 1950s. National Review is still around there today. It's hardly the flagship of conservatism. Intellectually, conservatives in the United States is incredibly fragmented today. In the 1950s, it was in many ways fused together through Buckley and his work at National Review. A lot of conservatives, even though they disagreed with each other, they all agreed that the big government and the New Deal state, the Cold War state, they all agreed that these were problems, but what you put in its place, they recognized that there were different answers there, right? These are fights that conservatives still have today. Traditionalists, government is a problem. We need to get rid of big government. We need to get back to individual commitments to Christian values and to strong nuclear families. Libertarians, however, they say, yes, government is a problem because it limits our freedom, but why would we want to return then to Christian values, right? I mean, a lot of libertarians are Christians, but a lot of libertarians are saying, why limit a person's freedom in saying that they have to be a Christian? They can't be an atheist. Or why do they have to be committed to a particular form of the family? And so traditionalists and libertarians, as much as they agreed at that time and continue to agree today that the strong state liberalism represented by someone like a Kennedy or Lyndon Johnson or an FDR, up until our day of Barack Obama, the Clintons, recognized these were problems. The solutions they did not necessarily ever agree upon. Nevertheless, National Review, Buckley was a fusing force for these different movements. It's in the 1960s that this new conservatism begins to transform into what we remember today as the new right. Just as the 1960s gave us a new left, we now have enough information to understand that there also was a new right forming at these years. If we think of people like Buckley and National Review as kind of conservatism, kind of a top-down conservatism, right? A lot of these guys are professors, they're elites, right? But they're producing ideas. These ideas would begin to find grassroots support in the 1960s. The base of the new right that would form in the 1960s, came from different areas. Suburban centers was one place. White suburban centers, I'd say, were one places where this is forming. We can look at, for instance, Orange County, California in the 1960s. And studying families, particularly studying women's activism in the 1960s, historians have found that this kind of emphasis on limited government but large military establishment was something that was being embraced by families, and particularly the wives of Orange County, California, or the housewives of Orange County, California. A little bit different than I think they're a little bit different than the TV show today. These housewives wanted to, return to Christian values, principles of limited government as they understood it, while maintaining a large military establishment. There's a reason for that. A lot of their husbands worked for the Defense Department. I think in Orange County, California, 40% of everyone who lived in that county worked for the Department of Defense, whether they were contractors, whether they actually were building the weapons of little and mass destruction. So these suburban centers, that especially those were part of America's new gun belt, were significant supporters, grassroots supporters for these new conservative ideas. White flighters, those families who were leaving integrated cities and moving out and establishing America's suburbs. In places like moving outside of Detroit and establishing places like Dearborn or Livonia, moving out of Center City, Philadelphia, and forming places like Newtown. These white flighters also embraced the principles of limited government for good reason. These were individuals, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of Americans in the 1960s who were resisting integration of public spaces in their cities. Resisting, as they see it, peacefully. They're African Americans move into their neighborhood. They move out. African Americans start attending their kids' schools. They take their kids out of those schools, put them in private schools. African Americans start traveling on buses. These white flighters start driving cars. White flight was a significant movement of the late 1950s, but especially in the 1960s and 1970s. The politics of white flight tended towards support for new conservative ideas. These white flighters supported limited government because they didn't want government their problem was in many ways government-enforced integration, stemming from the 1940s and 1950s. So when they went out and established these new white enclaves in places like Dearborn, Livonia, Newtown, and throughout the United States, even in some ways Spring Arbor is in some ways a white flight community from the city of Jackson. when they went out and established these new areas, they didn't want the government coming in and telling them again, oh yeah, you got to integrate your spaces. They resisted that then. They still resist that today. And so we have to understand white flight and the resistance to integration as one of the forces for the new conservatism, particularly the idea that government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem. Finally, another grassroots group, college students. We're left with the impression, and you might even think from the first lecture, that the 1960s college students were all a bunch of radical, hippie, leftist, counterculturalists. Not the case at all. There was a significant new conservative movement growing on American campuses. Yes, there was the Young Republicans, but the Young Republicans were being replaced in the 1960s by a group that started at William F. Buckley Jr.'s house in 1960, called the Young Americans for Freedom. I'll give you their, besides the Port Huron statement, I'll give you a copy of their Sharon statement, as it was called, because it was formed at Sharon, I think Massachusetts, where Buckley lived. But these college students went on to hold activism on their campus, rallies. Young Americans for Freedom were sponsoring rallies in 1962 and 1963 at places like Madison Square Garden, where Buckley would come out and 30,000 people would come out. I mean, the conservative activism, the conservative presence, especially in the early 1960s, before kind of the Vietnam War protests, was much bigger than anything the New Left was able to produce. And so college students, as much as they were on the left in the latter half of the 1960s and the early part of the 1960s, was conservative college students speaking both libertarian principles but also large military establishment principles. College students were, throughout the United States, were significant supporters of new conservative ideas too. In a significant movement of fusion, you had the 1964 presidential election. The guy you see featured in the middle there was Barry Goldwater. Goldwater, an Arizona politician. Goldwater, an Arizona politician, a libertarian, but also somebody who believed the United States needed to fight the Cold War to win. I mean, he liked to make jokes about lobbing nuclear weapons into the, lobbing nuclear weapons into the Kremlin. He seemed to almost favor kind of first strike against the Soviet Union. Keep that in mind when you read when you watch Dr. Strangelove, or I guess you've already watched Dr. Strangelove by that point. Sorry. Goldwater's campaign, well, it looked like an abject failure. I mean, Goldwater was easily defeated in 1964 by Lyndon Johnson. I don't know that anyone could have beat Lyndon Johnson, as Johnson's carrying the legacy of the assassinated John F. Kennedy, but Goldwater was so easily painted as an extremist at a time in which Americans had just gone through the Cuban Missile Crisis. And here's a guy who, jokes about, nuclear warfare. This is a guy who says things like extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. Well, in what happened to the Cuban Missile Crisis, extremism is not exactly where most Americans are at. So his extremism, his rhetoric was easily turned against him. Here you see his one of his catch slogans: "In your heart, you know he's right." Goldwater detractors, Lyndon Johnson supporters, came back with "In your guts, you know he's nuts," or "In your heart, you know he might," meaning he might start nuclear warfare. I'll send you a link to the Daisy ad, one of the most famous political ads in American history, that really, in many ways, and pun intended, blew up Goldwater's campaign. Goldwater's campaign was seen by many observers, particularly by liberals, as this new conservative, William F. Buckley Jr., white flight people, they were around for a little while, but clearly they are done. Clearly they are dead. And it's easy to understand when you're in the moment why you could think that, but in retrospect, Goldwater's campaign was one of the most significant developments in the conservative movement for a few reasons. One, during Goldwater's campaign, he's the one who really fuses these kind of top-down eggheads like Buckley Jr. with the bottom-up suburban warriors, the college students, the white flighters. They're the ones who find each other in 1960, 1964, fighting for Barry Goldwater's nomination first and for his election. So this is when these groups really connect with each other, where the National Review crowd, in these suburban women, these college students, these white flighters, they really find themselves for the first time in these 4 years of working for Goldwater, and they never really leave each other after that time. Yeah, the movement is defeated, but they never really leave. There'll be some purging of some of the more extreme elements of the New Conservative, namely the John Birch Society. The John Birch Society, if we don't get a chance to talk about this, was pushing the idea that fluoridation of water was a communist conspiracy, going back to the Strangelove movie. Some of those groups are kind of kicked out, but this fusion never really is broken. Goldwater campaign is significant also in that the fact that he could win the nomination, the fact that a Southern Republican beat a Southern Republican expressing these kind of libertarian but big military ideas, defeated an establishment liberal Republican, a New Deal Republican like Nelson Rockefeller from New York, was significant. Republican politicians, leading Republican politicians, don't come out of the South. Republicanism is a Northern and Midwestern phenomenon. Not after 1964. Increasingly, Southern Republicans would come to dominate that movement, and Southern Republicans espousing the ideas of the New Conservatism, limited government, traditional family values, and large military to defeat our enemies. And third, the Goldwater campaign is significant because it brings a number of people into Americans' radar who will go on to become future leaders of the new right. Phyllis Schlafly, who in the 1970s and 1980s was the leading anti-feminist spokesperson and organizer during those years. Phyllis Schlafly, Americans first learned that name, campaigning for Goldwater. She was a Goldwater gal, as interestingly enough Hillary Clinton was too. Her first political activism was as a Goldwater gal. Hillary Clinton was going around campaigning for Barry Goldwater, if you can imagine that. This Texas oil man, you might have heard of him before, George Herbert Walker Bush. Yeah, he will give a speech at the Republican National Convention, and leading some Republicans to say, this Bush guy, maybe these Texas guys have a future in American politics. But the person who really established himself as a chief spokesman for the New Conservatism and anti-liberalism in Goldwater's campaign was Ronald Reagan, who would give the most famous political speech of this election cycle, A Time for Choosing, which, if you want to educate yourself, you can go on YouTube and watch Reagan's A Time for Choosing speech, where he talks about all of us dying on the anthill of collectivism. Reagan establishes himself as an up-and-comer in the Republican Party, but especially in kind of this new Republican Party. Reagan would go on to, in 1966, be elected governor of California, where he would, as a New Conservative, his record's kind of mixed. Clearly, he stood for libertarian principles, rolling back the welfare state in California. Interestingly, Ronald Reagan, while he was governor, voted for liberalizing abortion laws in California. But that was not uncommon for Republicans. I know this will sound counterintuitive, but the reality is that Republican governors were generally supportive of liberalizing abortion laws in the 1960s. It was the Democrats, particularly Catholic Democrats, who were the leading pro-lifers during these years, and that all would shift around in the 1970s. So Reagan would establish himself through the Goldwater campaign, governor of California, run for the nomination of the Republican Party in 1976. Gerald Ford gets it. Gerald Ford loses to Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter has a terrible time as president, and just a number of crises he was not able to control or manage. And so Ronald Reagan runs against Carter in 1980, and Ronald Reagan will come into the presidency. Of course, you'll be reading Ronald Reagan's inaugural address if you haven't done so already. We'll talk more about Reagan's philosophy that he introduces in just a few minutes. Oh, I guess we'll talk about it right now. Ronald Reagan, as you'll be reading, government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. My shorthand for conservative policy is less is more. Less is more. Less government equals more freedom, more opportunity, more prosperity. Less is more. Less government, more freedom, more opportunity, more prosperity. In terms of domestic policy, Reagan, a spokesperson in the 1990s, Republicans would win Congress back and would begin to actually instituting these things, cut taxes, cut welfare spending, deregulate the economy. In terms of foreign policy, large military establishment, especially using military spending to help to stabilize the economy, and to keep millions of Americans at work, making weapons of little and mass destruction. You asked, when did World War II end? In some ways, in terms of defense spending, World War II never really ended. We found ways, especially through the Cold War, to maintain high levels of military spending all the way into the present, right? One thing to ask yourself is, if this is kind of the conservative toolkit, if you will, for what conservatives stand for, is Donald Trump a conservative in the way that Ronald Reagan was a conservative? A lot of people didn't want to admit that. Some Republicans today would still want to say Donald Trump's not a good conservative. I don't know. If this is the kind of things Ronald Reagan stood for, aren't these also the things that Donald Trump stands for as well, too? And so do we need to admit that, in fact, Donald Trump not only is a good Republican, but he might be a quintessential Republican. He might even be more Reagan than Reagan, something we'll have to talk about. Very quickly, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but one of the foundations for the new right forming in the 1970s and into the present, the so-called religious right, or evangelical conservatives, as they're sometimes called. And you see a number of people there who helped this new conservatism, as it was called, this new evangelicalism, as it was called in the 1950s. Billy Graham was one of these new evangelicals. Francis Schaeffer in the bottom corner there was a new evangelical. I know a few of you know Francis Schaeffer's name. I lectured on this in Core 200. On the right-hand side there, Jerry Falwell, who, no, he's not dead there. He's going down a water slide. He basically said, look, if I raise so much money for my television show in university, I'll go down my Empire's water slide. And they raised some money, so there's Jerry Falwell going down a water slide. And then in the corner there, Ralph Reed, who was a political organizer who helped kind of connect the new right and the religious right to each other during the 1980s. The traditional conservatives of the 1950s were people like Buckley. They were Catholics. By the 1970s, the leaders of the traditional wing of the conservative movement and of the new right increasingly were people like Billy Graham, Jerry Falwell, Ralph Reed, who are kind of combining this concern for limited government with a commitment to traditional Christian family values. So a kind of joining of Christian nationalism and libertarianism is happening during these years. And beginning with Reagan, Reagan actively courted these new evangelicals like Graham and Falwell. They understood they were upset with Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was a good evangelical believer himself. But when people like Falwell went to Carter and went to Falwell and said, "Hey, will you support our agenda? We're very concerned about this Roe versus Wade abortion decision. We're very concerned about protecting Christian schools. We're very concerned about restoring Christian rhetoric in American life. We're really concerned about fighting what they called secular humanism." Carter, while an evangelical, just really wasn't having it. And so very quickly people like Falwell were discouraged by Carter, and along comes Ronald Reagan saying things like, "Hey, I know you guys can't endorse me, but I endorse you," meaning put me in office and I'm going to fight for the kind of things you want. I will defend Christian nationalism. I will fight abortion, even though he had, as governor, had helped liberalize abortion. Reagan is now, "I will help you fight abortion." And Reagan is the person who helps to establish the idea that if you are a good Bible-believing Christian, you are also a Republican. Before that, a lot of evangelicals, because they are Southerners, a lot of evangelicals are, in fact, Democrats. It's people like Falwell and Graham and Reagan who help bring evangelicals out of the Democratic Party and into the Republican Party in the 1980s and especially in the 1990s. And so from the 1990s all the way up to the present, evangelicals remain a significant coalition, a significant grassroots support base for Republican politicians, particularly for new right Republican politicians like a Newt Gingrich or a Mitt Romney or a Donald Trump. That's not to say evangelical support has always been consistent. Sometimes evangelicals stay home. In 2000, evangelicals didn't give a lot of support to George W. Bush. Not that they voted for Al Gore, they just didn't really come out and vote in great numbers, and that's why that election was so close. In 2004, evangelicals came out in much greater numbers, and Bush had a much more significant victory at that time. Evangelicals didn't lend a lot of support to John McCain in 2008, and Barack Obama won. They did not lend a lot of support to Mitt Romney, largely because Romney's Mormon. And so Obama won again in 2012. They did not make that mistake in 2016. Evangelicals, in fact, 81% estimates are of evangelicals came out in support of Donald Trump. And the expectation is that they will vote for Donald Trump in even greater numbers in 2000. All the polls suggest that self-professing evangelicals today are not only staunch Trump supporters, they're staunch Republicans on pretty much every issue. Obviously, on the issues that were central to the religious right, like abortion and protecting Christian school rights, but even on issues like immigration, on welfare, evangelicals are to the right of most Republicans on supporting the Republican agenda. But again, understand the way in which the 1960s was a time in which these evangelicals, or this new evangelical movement, was kind of forming during these years as well too. So again, trying to type the 1960s as just kind of one thing. It's the era of the hippies, or the era of the anti-war, the era of civil rights or women's rights, misses the complexity of the 1960s. While liberals and conservatives were not necessarily fighting with each other that much during these years, it was mainly liberals fighting liberals that were really the most consequential fights. Conservatives were mobilizing. Your Ronald Reagan, William F. Buckley Jr., Barry Goldwater Republicans were were fighting each other, were developing the coalition that would eventually put them into power in 1980 and have a significant impact on our political culture all the way up to the present. Evangelicals, or these new evangelicals, were finding themselves too in the 1950s and 1960s, ultimately moving into a political agenda in the 1970s and 1980s. And they are still there today. So understand that the 1960s, a lot of these movements that formed during these years, a lot of these coalitions that are formed, they're still with us today. They still have a significant influence in our public life, and especially in our politics. The final thing I want to say is, for as much as the kind of descendants of the new left and the new right today continue to fight with each other, right? You know, the whole red state, blue state, liberal, conservative conflicts today, understand some things that they have in common, particularly the value of choice, right? In many ways, the legacy of both the new left and the new right is a commitment to choice. And the individualism ultimately that underlies that idea of choice. That choice seems to be an unmitigated positive value for many Americans on the left and for the right. A problematic choice, right? The way that the pro-choice movement is often framed, a woman's right to choose. Well, is that legitimate? Whether to maintain or terminate a pregnancy, is that really a legitimate issue of choice or not? For Christians who believe that abortion is murder, yeah, you don't really have a choice in committing murder, right? On the new right side, the belief that choice is always better, having more choice is always better. So, believing that, for instance, a national healthcare policy is ultimately a form of totalitarianism, and that we need is more choice in healthcare. Well, is that true? Is more choice or more options necessarily the best thing? In some areas, yes. In some areas, other. But we need to understand the psychology of choice. And if you're looking for some summer reading, I would encourage everyone to read Barry Schwartz's book, The Paradox of Choice. Having more choice in some areas is good. Having more choice in other areas, not so good. Have you guys... Oh man, I was about to show my age. It's like, have you ever gone to a video store to try to pick out a movie with a group? And I realize you guys don't have video stores. Have you ever gotten on Netflix? There we go. Have you ever gotten on Netflix and tried to figure out, in a group of like 5 or 6 people, what movie to watch? It's frustrating, right? Even as an individual, like, what movie should I watch? I have like 35 movies to choose from here. What movie should I watch? What movie best defines me as a person on a Friday night at 10 o'clock? Choice can be a source of frustration, a source of anxiety, a source of mental disorder. Maybe we could say having an abundance of choice of cereal is a good thing. Having choice of healthcare, is that necessarily best, or would it be just to have, or would removing choice in certain areas ultimately be better, not just for the delivery of a particular service, but also just for people's mental health? And so, for as much as the liberals and conservatives fight with each other today, understand some of the things they have in common, like a commitment to choice, and think more on your own. Maybe we can talk a little bit about this during our, if we have a virtual Zoom, you guys show up, we can talk about this. Whether choice is an unmitigated good, or whether choice is good in some cases, not so good in other cases, and maybe we need to learn to be more discriminating in that ideal. Yeah, I think that's all I got. See you soon.